Hey, Chris with Codify Academy here. In this video, I want to explore what happens to elements when we change their display value to inline block and how that differs from block and inline values. First, we know that the CSS property display is going to determine how the element displays in a screen. So if it's block, it's going to take up the full width. And if it's an inline element, it's just going to take up the space of its content. And all HTML elements are either defaulted to block or inline. Here we have our div. This is defaulted to block, so it takes up the full screen. And our span by default is an inline element, so it just takes up the space of its content. And we can change those defaults. An inline block element is basically the same as an inline element. The only difference is we can actually apply a width and a height to an inline block element, and the margin that we apply will affect the top and bottom of the element. We'll see that in a minute here. And so you're probably asking, why would we want to change an element from inline to inline block or from block to inline block? Good question. So let's take a look at 3 examples really quick. The first example we have here is going to be a span element. This is an inline element, and all inline elements will behave the same way as this one. So if we add a margin here, we notice it's only going to apply on the left and the right sides. It adds it to the top and the bottom, but it's not actually applying to the element because it's an inline element, and that's just how they work. Now let's add a border here. We'll see the element a little bit easier. And if we add some padding, we'll see it does apply all around again. Now it's actually inside another element, so that's not good either. And if we try height, well, nothing changes. So let's add display inline block, and voila! Now the box model properties are applying. We can see the height, we can see the margin, and the padding are all being applied properly. So if we need to add any box model properties like margin, padding, width, height, and so on, to an inline element, like images or spans or anchor tags, make sure that you change the display from inline to inline block. Alright, so example number 2, let's look at a group of divs here. We have one that wraps 3 identical items. Each item is going to take up the full row because they're div, and the H2 and P tags, they're all block elements. Now let's imagine we want these 3 items to sit next to each other. This is very common on a website. Normally we would add float to the left, and we would define a width on these items, and they would all sit next to each other. But now the issue is that the wrapping element no longer has a height. And if other elements would also start behaving very differently as well. We do not want that, because when you float an element, other elements no longer interact with it or even see it. So that's why we get this height of 0 on this wrap. But if we change the display to inline block on each item and remove this float, we'll see that the height no longer is 0, but the height is based on the elements inside of it again. And our third example, when we're using list items, a lot of times we want those items to sit next to each other, like in a Google replica. We wanted them to go from sitting one on top of another to sitting next to each other. So all we had to do was add display inline block to the LI tag. And then it worked. They sat next to each other. It's pretty nice. Now that you know a little bit more about inline block, I want to show you a goal that you should have when you're building a website. Don't try to put too much pressure on yourself to get this done right away. We are learning here, but every time you build a website, you want to try to build it like this. As we hover over each wrapper element, we can see each section is clearly blocked together. Now here's a good example of one. As we scroll through, each section is clearly following the next, and so on till it's done. And here's a bad example. We did this one together. This was our Google replica. Now if we hover over the elements, we see they don't go one after another. They're actually kind of spread around a little bit, which actually works, but we had to do some CSS hacks to make it look like this. And if we look at it in another screen, you might not know this yet, but it would look really, really bad. So if we went back and we used display inline block instead of floats on Google, it will be a lot easier to manage the elements as we style them. Now, unfortunately, we still have to show you this because floats are what you'll most likely see on the job. The issue there is that if code is not broken, it doesn't get fixed. So if something was created years ago, but it's still working, they're going to keep using it. But now you know that you can actually apply block, inline, or inline block to any element you want. So get out there and try using it.